I call to order the Tuesday, October 9th, 2018 meeting of the City of Davenport Historic Preservation Commission. The Commission has before it the consideration of the September 11th, 2018 meeting minutes. Are there any changes, deletions, or additions? Hearing none, I would entertain a motion to approve the minutes. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor of approving the minutes of September 11th, 2018 signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, minutes are approved. Communications. Brian, you want to advise everybody about what we're going to do with the ordinance?
Yes, I'll first point out I did see something from SHPO about the annual Historic Preservation Summit, and that's over the summer, so I'll forward that information to you. Also, that we're not going to have enough time. I sent an email, but we're not going to have enough time to do the Historic Preservation Ordinance and have enough time for SHPO to review it and have it be adopted at the same time as. So I'm just going to kind of move the existing ordinance over, but we can continue to work on that. I don't want to stop working on it because of that. The petition for the public library is not quite ready. I've seen a draft of it. We need a little bit of work. We did advertise for it, so what I'm going to ask is that the public hearing be opened, that you ask if anybody is here to speak on the item, and then a motion to table that. That way we keep the item, the public hearing open, and we don't have to re-advertise, essentially.
All right. Are there any other communications from commission members tonight? Seeing none. We have no old business. Under new business is case LL 18-01. That's a nomination of the Davenport Public Library at 321 Main Street for the designation as a city local historic landmark. Amy Groscove with the Davenport Public Library is the petitioner. I will now open a public hearing on this item. Is there anyone here to speak to it? Seeing no one, at the petitioner's request, I would entertain a motion to table this item until November 13th, 2018.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor of tabling signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, this item is tabled. We'll move on to item B, and that's case number DNR HP 18-01, and that's demolish an outbuilding at 1009 College Avenue. The Walker Adams House is individually listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Bill Hummons is the petitioner. Staff report.
I have spoken with the petitioner. I've mentioned that he should come here. I've called him a couple times, and he's not here. So the commission can do what it chooses if it wants to table or consider it tonight. That's up to you guys. Property is individually listed on the National Register. There is a brief mention of the outbuilding that you can see in the background in the site inventory form. Not a whole lot of detail on it. But this property is on the National Register. There is a notice to tear down or repair the outbuilding from the city. I think the property owner has let the building go for many, many years. It's got a slight lean to it. We'll go through the pictures in a second. But the property is listed on the National Register, and so the process for this would be if this commission feels that the property is eligible to be listed as a local historic landmark, you could vote to delay this demolition request, and then staff would come back, prepare a local landmark nomination for the purposes of saving this. I know this commission has exercised some caution, particularly when a property owner is not coming forward and asking you to do that, but sometimes that's how in the past I've expressed that these things can get kind of messy. So again, you don't normally regulate this property because it's on the National Register. The exception just becomes if somebody wants to demolish a building, and that's the case here. And it's only the outbuilding. I guess that's probably the best one to look at. I don't know that the property itself, obviously you're not going to look at the outbuilding and say that we want to landmark just the outbuilding. You would have to landmark the entire property and say that the property itself and the building and the outhouse together warrant local landmark. I don't feel that it gets there. Some of the descriptions in the nomination refer to it as a good example, not necessarily a great example. We don't have information on an architect who designed this building. It appears that, at least when the site inventory form was done, that Walker Adams was living at this house, or living at this property prior to, so they were guessing that this was the second house on the property. So it's staff's recommendation to allow the demolition of the outbuilding to proceed.
Are there any questions from commission members? Commissioner McGivern.
Ryan, I drove by this property. It was a couple months ago. There was a for sale sign out. Did this transfer at all?
No.
Do we know? Okay. And has this been converted to multifamily?
Yes.
Okay. Because it's a really great pocket neighborhood of some pretty amazing homes, and this kind of sticks out. Do we know the real purpose of the demolition, of what they're going to do, and is it really salvageable or not?
Well, anything is salvageable.
I understand
That's
that.
Yeah, but at what cost? And so there's kind of different levels of saying, well, if it is salvageable, can you compel somebody to spend more money on something that it's worth? I looked to the assessor records and I didn't see a line item for just what the value of the outbuilding is, but I can't imagine it's that much. This gentleman I spoke to, he didn't mention anything about the sale, but what he did mention is he had this notice that, had intentions of doing something many years ago with it and just never did it. And so I don't believe there's any immediate plans to do anything with that portion of the property, other than just to alleviate the city code violation on it.
I guess my concern is everything through City Hall and government is a process. And so if he's going to demolish it, which is, driving by it, I can understand his desire, but a concrete slab for parking for multifamily would impact all the surrounding houses. And so this is the city's one bite at the apple to make sure that whatever's going to happen is going to be done right. And the lack of the owner's inability to show up and what is really going to happen and how's that going to impact some very historic properties surrounding that is a concern to me. Not the demolition itself, but what's the end product going to be and what are you going to do?
I understand what you're saying. It's a little tricky because you're tasked with reviewing, and we get into this debate of, well, let's separate the process here. We're supposed to be looking at the demolition, but what are you going to build there? Even though that's not your purview.
I understand that.
But
the fact that the petitioner didn't show up is
sure,
cause enough to say no right now or to hold off.
Sure.
And maybe we can get those answers at the same time.
Certainly can table.
Understand. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Commissioner.
I had a question also about the National Register. When you say the property is on the National Register, individually listed, does that mean this outbuilding is part of that, or does that mean the
Yes.
house?
They both, the property is. So a lot of times what I do on the site inventory form is I'll look on the site inventory form to hope that there is some reference to the outbuilding. In this case, there was on the site inventory form. So the property is historic.
Well, that would concern me along with what was previously stated, because I would want to know from the owner, he says through you that he's not going to do anything, or he's not sure, doesn't have any plans to, but if this were replaced with a quote-unquote new garage or slab, I would have some concerns about that.
I understand what you say, but if this were let's just assume, for instance, that this building wasn't here, you would have no regulation over that whatsoever.
That gets back to the difference between a local landmark and a National Register property. We're going through a process that is at best messy, but it was the only thing that staff could come up with when the ordinance was created in 1990, and they were instructed by the then Plan and Zoning Commission, because a retired other committee that had been doing review for the city was retired, so the Plan and Zone Commission charged a new preservation ordinance to review National Register demolitions, because at that time in the 90s was the worst part of the downturn here in Davenport, and wholesale blocks of buildings were coming down at the time. So it's something that this commission needs to address and clean up when we rewrite the ordinance. But I have to agree with staff. It comes down to whether or not we believe this building is salvageable, and then that creates a whole lot of work for staff, because our only way to go forward is to instruct staff to begin a landmark designation for the entire property. And then you get into the question whether this one property in that area, under our criteria and then state review, meets that criteria. Clearly from some of the pictures, this building has some significant structural damage, and it's more than likely the old enemy, water. And it appears that it's gotten in, and there's some rafters, and then that it's probably rotted the top plate and possibly all the way down to the bottom plate on that one wall, and that's why you have that large V in the wall. And again, the city's going to order it down, and if the property owner doesn't do it, the city taxpayers are going to pay for it. So it's a conundrum. I've been by here, and while I would fight for the house, the outbuilding I'm not so sure about. Commissioner Cordes.
In a National Register consideration of this property, the significance is architectural, and it's essentially for the house itself. The carriage house is from the same period as the house, or approximately the same. And so it's also listed as a resource. If the National Register process was looking at the carriage house by itself, and even though it's an 1861, circa 61 structure, it might possibly be eligible, but it would be a lot harder case to make. There would have to be special historical significance, because there really isn't any architectural significance. I don't know if there's unique methods of building of the building, or whether it's simply typical of the time.
You know, if I just might add something popped in my head, that's a
Yeah.
great point. And the outbuilding that jumps to my mind is the stone outbuilding in the Homburg district.
Which is a unique and
Yes,
special
right.
and important building. And that stone building actually predates the structure that's on its current property, the way it's divided. But it's a contributing structure on the property as opposed to a non-contributing modern structure on the property. And so it's appropriately listed the way it is, but its significance is much less than the primary resource on the property. That said, we all would prefer to not see it be demolished, and then staff's comments on the cost related to what it would cost to get it back into good repair and get rid of the city citation or orders that exist. Is it listed as a dangerous building?
It's not classified as a public hazard that's posing an immediate threat. So there's just an order that a building is in disrepair and that it either be demolished or repaired.
And I agree with everything that Bob said also, but, and I have a concern. Is there an explanation in writing from the owner as to why demolition is the only or his best recourse?
Just conversations that I've had with him.
Okay. And then he's not here.
Correct.
Does this person have the ability to appear here?
Yes.
Or,
I mean,
or to
he's-
communicate in writing?
Yep, he's an older
Explain.
gentleman. He came to my office twice.
Okay.
There was no expression of a desire to repair the building at all. And so his thought was, well, I can have somebody salvage the material on there. So I'm sure his demolition costs were lessened at that point. I
Yeah.
don't know if he has the means to repair it or not.
Okay. Because it would seem that financial hardship, whether or not he has the means, but a financial estimate or some kind of financial information as to what is the cost of repair and therefore that is not realistic, and I won't invest that amount of money into that building. I don't know if we need that, but it seems like something that would be appropriate.
Yeah, and so, I mean, the way the ordinance says is it refers you back to, and it says the Preservation Commission can request this information. And so, a report from a structural engineer is something that's on the list, and I've gone through that criteria in the staff report. It's one of, people are kicking and screaming usually when it comes to producing this structural report because they've got to spend money on an engineer to tell them something that they believe is the case.
Well, that would be the case when somebody is trying to establish that demolition is the only course to proceed. But when it's when it's a financial decision that demolition is what makes the most sense, it would seem that an engineer's report might not be necessary, but some contractor's estimate of what it would cost to repair the building, which can usually be obtained at no cost. Now, I suspect, it's kind of obvious to me that it's going to be pretty expensive, but I don't know what the condition is of the
Right.
of the plate and the bottoms of the vertical members and.
And I've expressed this many times, where I always come back to is, are you and ultimately the city council willing to landmark this to save it? And that is where I always struggle with this process, because that is the process. If the owner says, that's what I want to do, and so that this commission then is compelled to say, we want to designate the project. So then I always circle back to that question.
Coming to those decisions would be much easier with just a little bit more data and an appearance of the owner.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
I think
We
it appears.
We can table it for a month.
Sure. Yeah.
I think
we
it,
are also under a time frame too.
Yeah, we're
Under the
okay with
ordinance.
timeframe to consider it next month.
And Ryan's right. It comes down to eventually,
yeah,
if the owner does not provide us with information, does this structure and property raise to a local landmark status? And because it's a lot of work creating that form for Ryan, and then we have to vote on it, and then we decide whether or not to send it along to city council.
and
Also, if deterioration gets worse, the building department can request the fire marshal to declare it a nuisance and a danger. And it will be out of our hands at that time also.
Yeah. I mean, I've got no personal stake
So-
in this at all, so whatever you.
I'm
guys
not
wanna do.
opposed to tabling it for a month, asking the owner if he can get a cost estimate from a contractor.
I know-
And see whether or not he'll appear.
I know Jack Haberman's familiar with the property, so maybe.
Jack would be a good one for an estimate, and he probably wouldn't charge the owner anything. Commissioner McGivern.
Staff is the one that used the adjective messy. This is a messy process and everything. And I think the commission has been pretty flexible with petitioners that come forward. My concern is that I know it's possible to get anything through City Hall if you just dissect it in a certain direction. And my concern isn't necessarily the structure itself because it's aged, but the surrounding properties that are historically significant. You know, if there is demolition, I know it's outside of our purview of how is he going to demolish it? Is he going to fold the foundation away or anything? But those are really important matters that impact that immediate neighborhood. And my purpose of asking, I'm going to ask for a table is one, the petitioner didn't show up, but two, to give City Hall time and maybe the ward alderman or whatever to make sure the basis is covered for the neighborhood. It's probably not financially feasible to keep it. Some historically in the past have said, it's demolition by neglect, which I never buy into. It's just not financially feasible, and I get that. But I think City Hall has a responsibility to make sure that whatever happens does no harm to the surrounding neighborhood. And if our only ace in our back pocket is, well, we could landmark it, then that is the process of City Hall. And that's my only point.
I think at an absolute minimum, we would ask for the demo of the foundation. We wouldn't just.
I would agree.
You mentioned a lot of good points, Commissioner McGivern. And that comes back to there's one certain way to protect a neighborhood,
Landmark.
and that's landmark the National Register
You know
district.
if you look at some of the adjacent
And
properties.
we have
there-
that ability, and that has not gone well
I don't-
with previous councils.
Yeah, but if you look at the adjacent structures on College, you see some that are not of this era, and so this is kind of a gem in that.
Commissioner Kale.
I don't know if I remember what I was gonna ask. What
Turn your mic on.
this would be one of my first ones of these since I have been on this commission, so I just have some questions. What are we allowed to require of the property owner if they choose to demolish this building? Anything? Is that maybe something I just didn't read thoroughly enough in this about?
So it's this criteria here.
Okay. So it is in there. I can review it, Ryan. You don't have to.
So this is the criteria that's contained in if you were demolishing a local landmark property.
Okay.
And then, as Chair referred to, at the end of the ordinance, it says, because, obvious add-on, Well, if somebody wants to demolish a National Register property, you can first vote to delay, and essentially what it says is, it essentially kind of refers you back to this other section of the code.
Okay. Okay. I guess I would like to to come up with whatever criteria we'd like to request from the owner, and then make a motion to request that from him and delay to next month.
I think that's a great idea. Yeah.
So, Dave, sorry, does anyone, whatever, that's not.
Commissioner Corders?
Yes. The subject that I was thinking about was Ryan talked about whether or not we felt that the building was eligible, met the eligibility requirements as a local landmark. And the way it seems to me that I tend to look at it is because lots of times the question comes up related to a contributing structure within a historic district. And there's a lot of those structures that are not individually eligible for the National Register, and therefore probably really aren't suitable to be nominated or placed on the local landmark list. And it seems to me that the criteria for local landmark parallels and is the same as the National Register for individual listing on the National Register. And so I look at this building, the primary resource on the property, and say, is it eligible as a local landmark? And it's like, absolutely yes. We don't have very many of buildings from that era and that particular style in Davenport. It's on a very short list of those, and they were more typical in other places in eastern Iowa, particularly Burlington and Mount Pleasant and Fairfield, Mediapolis. But it certainly is eligible as a local landmark. Would it still be eligible without the carriage barn? Yeah, obviously it still would. But the carriage barn is also important. And I don't know what that means. I'm not sure we want to go down that pathway. It essentially, if we would decide to deny the request for demolition, then it automatically proceeds down that pathway for local landmark. And I guess my only comment is it's certainly eligible for that. But it's all around the primary resource on the property. And the barn is kind of an appendage to that. And I've seen properties where the barn is really incredible and of high significance, and maybe even equal significance to the residents. In other cases where it's just strictly a utilitarian building that was not particularly special. And I would guess, I could be wrong, but I would guess that the clapboard siding that's on that structure probably is not original. They probably didn't put clapboard on a barn at that time, and there's a change, but that's just my own personal guess on it. But I don't know. This process for us would be a lot easier if the owner was here to make a case. And to talk about why this is his best option, or only option. I would be in favor of tabling it if we decided to do that.
Commissioner Kale?
Okay, so this is probably also something that could be resolved by reading, but, okay, so say we decide, you know what, we don't want him to tear it down, we want it to get landmarked. We go through that process. He still doesn't have the money to tear it down. If it's a financial issue, then what?
So what happens is you would first vote to delay the demolition. By voting to delay, you direct staff to prepare a local landmark nomination. That nomination comes before you. You vote to recommend on that nomination.
Right.
That nomination then goes to the full city council, and then the city council would have to adopt an ordinance to designate this property a local historic landmark.
Right, so I understand that, but then what happens to the barn if he still can't afford to fix it?
The order would have to stay, and so the criteria, I believe, is much stronger for a local landmark, even though it kind of refers you to the same section. So the order to repair or demolish would remain.
Okay,
It would just be that this commission would not approve demolition, so he'd be compelled to repair it.
repair it. Okay, okay, sorry, that was all.
Or,
If it became a hazard, you didn't repair it, then it becomes what?
Yeah, I mean, I have to believe, then it could be ordered down by the city without approval from anybody, essentially. You know, I have to, yeah, you know, this situation is somewhat different than somebody that's just coming to you without any formal action from another city department. If this was just a guy who said, I just want to demolish this, and this commission said no, and he could say, well, I'm just gonna let it go. At least there's a formal action from the city at this point with in order to do something, and so I don't anticipate that going away.
Commissioner?
I vote to table this till next month. Or can I,
You
Second.
move to
I
table
move
this
to
for-
table this till next month.
Is there a second on the tabling motion?
Second.
Any discussion?
Earlier it was discussed that we'd table it with the idea that he would come back with maybe a bid from a contractor to fix it up.
I would say, yeah, perhaps the discussion I heard was maybe not so far as the structural analysis, but something from somebody that had some expertise with historic buildings or a contractor that provided some kind of estimation of cost to repair. That's understood.
Would we have specifics? I mean, I saw maybe a window, second story window that had been boarded over, or maybe isn't there. Would we have specifics of what we'd want the contractor to bid out?
My suggestion would be to return it to working order. But there's different levels. I mean, you know, some people mothball buildings and want to stabilize the structure and in order to stabilize it so that some future owner can repair it. So I don't, I'd have to talk to the enforcement division about what level of repair are you looking for. I don't think they're, judging by some of the buildings that are out there, I can't imagine they would be requiring, you know, that this be completely, a restoration, exactly. So my suggestion would be to repair it, to bring it back to good working order and for it to be usable. But that's also up to you guys.
Commissioner McIvern?
Just so you're clear with what I'm looking for. Petitioner didn't show up. There's no doubt in my mind that it's not financially feasible to save this. I drove by it, took a look at it, but there's a lot of surrounding properties of significance that goes outside of our purview. So we can only deal with what's in front of us, even though we know the big picture idea. So what I'm looking for is something for our file, the city's file, to show that it's not financially feasible. And then if it's within our purview, what is the end result of demolition, foundation removal, grade and seeding, or, I mean, that might go beyond what we can ask for, but at least if I'm a tax-paying neighbor and I knew that the city had a bite of the apple to protect the neighborhood and we didn't ask any questions, as a neighbor, I'd be concerned.
Good point.
And that's all, from my perspective, that's all I'm really looking for. And I know we've got a couple other items that are there. If we can do a special meeting down the road to, if it works for the commissioners, I wouldn't be opposed to that. I don't think we're trying to be an obstacle. I think what we're trying to do is make sure it's right, and then we kind of got an eye out for the people that live around it.
I believe the stormwater ordinance covers demolitions too, because you can't let your property slide onto another person's property. And a demolition, of course, opens a big sore and everything, so the construction specialist, I would think, would check on that.
I would agree with you. I think there are limitations on size, so, but just to be extra sure, I think it's a good idea to, get something of, I have an old garage foundation across the alley, and they just removed the garage and left, so
Commissioner?
It would seem that that foundation would be within the purview of the city's repair order, repair or demolish order, and that if they did demolish, that there would still be work left to do and required by the city to be done until it meets the city's demolition standard, which probably has changed since the one that.
It's, to Commissioner McGivern's point, it's good to talk about it and to make sure that this isn't something that just slips through the cracks and, the building comes down. And to that, that's a good point.
If there's no other discussion, roll call. Oh,
I have a question about, it appears to me that the commission can also request possible new uses for the property should demolition be the final decision. And I know that you mentioned that the property owner said he really didn't have any, was that correct? He really didn't have
For
ideas?
For the area, for the outbuilding? Mm-hmm. Correct.
However, I think it might be good to have the property owner on record.
Sure.
I would like to have that question asked of him and see how he responds at that point.
and again, that's another great point in the ordinance that actually refers to the primary building on the property. I don't think we've ever questioned another use for an outbuilding on a property, because we don't get a lot of outbuilding demolition requests.
We are beginning, new code is going to allow garage apartments, so there's a potential use. So that's, I don't think we've ever, I think we've
Well,
only
then
demolished
the
one outbuilding,
new
and that was in the
historic
village.
preservation ordinance better regulate those
Oh, that,
in districts.
I know what just jumped to my mind. You have the criteria for local landmark nomination, which I agree, it's parallel to the National Register. I just for discussion, and we can discuss this more, it just seems like, should that criteria be elevated when it's not a willing property owner? Do you know what I mean?
And in the past, the council has usually always sided with an unwilling property owner.
So maybe it's
Just
got to get
saying.
2 out of 3. I don't know.
So, roll call to table this until next month's meeting. Okay. Commissioner?
Yes, just one additional question for staff. And I think this would relate to Bob's particular concerns and all of our concerns, that if the barn was demolished, given where the property lines are and where the remaining buildings would be, the right-of-way lines and so forth, what could be constructed in that spot? And you don't need to try to answer it on the fly, because it's a complicated question. You'd have to take measurements and all kinds of things.
Yeah.
But that would be a data piece that would also be a little bit interesting, I think.
Yeah, I mean, setbacks for outbuildings, although this is right on that property line, are pretty minimal. And so you could have another outbuilding potentially here. You could have a garage apartment with the new code. You could have a parking slab. You could have another accessory building.
But then there's also the amount of the land of the property that can be covered by buildings and,
That's also in the new code, yes.
yeah. And
Which is going to be fun to try and figure out, like, for a property like this.
I mean, it could be a situation, once that building's gone, that
Sure.
that you couldn't put anything back.
That's correct.
And I suppose if that's the case, that the property owner might want to thoroughly understand that there might be value
To retaining it.
to retain the building and doing some, get a roof on, straighten it up a little bit. Replace the rotted timbers, whatever that is going on. Deal with drainage. It's just it's a piece of the situation that I think is important, both for the property owner and for us to have that data.
Roll call.
Ready? All right. Cordis? Yes. Keel? Yes. Wanio?
Yes.
McGivern?
Yes.
Franken? And Free.
Yes. We have no other business tonight. Is there anyone who would address the commission for public forum? Seeing none, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Is there a second? All those in favor of adjournment signify by saying aye. Those opposed, the commission is adjourned.